All right, so the next one we're going to do, it's just an animated plane. So it's very similar to what we've done here. This will be used for a projector presentation. I believe I showed this last week or the week before, how they can take projectors, shine them on surfaces, and make it look like that surface is more than just a flat plane. I showed that before? Yes, okay. So this is the concept of it, okay? You'll see that just by looking at what I'm showing here, that this looks already very familiar to what we've already done with the title sequence. But there are some new things that I want to show with this specifically, okay? So you'll see that there's a plane, there's still a random, and then we'll go from there, okay? So I'm going to make a new file. Obviously, you want to, you want to go to your 2510 folder, you want to copy your template, and you want to call this animated plane. There we go. Okay. You also want to set your preferences so that your title, your stuff is being picked up from the correct folder. That's not the correct folder. There it is. Okay. All right. And then I'll save this into the correct area. Okay, so we're going to start this off first doing something you know, and then we'll add to that, okay? So this is an animated plane. So this is something eventually I'm going to show next week. I'll bring in the projector. I'll show you how the system works, where we can actually project stuff and make it look like there's actually something else going on besides just boring stuff, okay? We want to start off with completely black, and then we want to go with a colored image, okay? The brighter the better. So I'm going to create just a plane, just a regular plane from underneath here. There's a plane somewhere right there. Make that a little bit bigger, whatever. I'm going to go to my display. I'm going to show my shading lines. Obviously, these will be broken apart. So the shape of these will dictate the shape of what is going to be broken apart. If I want rectangles, I'll leave it stretched out. So the rectangles, if I want squares, I'll square them up. I typically like squares, so I'm going to square it up. Then what we did on the text one, same thing. We would do the poly effects, drop it into the plane, and now it's broken apart, right, just like our title. Then we would go through our effectors, and we would add a plane, and then we would also add a random. Okay, now I make sure the random didn't do anything. When I grab my effector, on my poly effector, the random isn't in there, so I can just drag it into that list. So if for some reason I didn't click the right thing, you can always drop it back in there. Just as easily, you can turn things off, turn things on, just to see what they're going to do. Okay. So very simple. Oops. Go back to that. Turn this back on. I'm going to grab both of these at the same time. I'm going to change these to box. And if you're not comfortable with the tools, play with the tools, okay? That's how you're going to get comfortable with them. So something like this, years ago, if you want to create that animation, it would take you like a long time to do. But Cinema makes it so easy. I'm going to make this box bigger, so I'll take the scale up. That way it doesn't mean so much. This way, there we go. I'm going to take my plane parameters. And right now it's just moving it in the Y direction. But you'll see that as it moves it in the Y, yep, there it is. It's also moving it a little bit in the X and Z. That's coming from my random. So just so you can see where it's coming from, if I turn this off, my plane is just moving it in the Y direction. But the Y direction is actually like up and down, okay, like along this area. So that's kind of a weird direction to be moving that, so I'm just going to turn that off. And nope, not that one. Go with this. Sweet. Okay, so now it's basically moving straight up, which is what I wanted. If I go to my random and I turn this back on, now I'll obviously get some more random movement inside there. You'll notice that the stuff on top of this Okay, so right here, all of this is random, and then these up here are not random. They're just moved up. This goes into the poly effects here. Do you see how plane is on top and random's on the bottom? Yes, we do. Okay. So what happens is first we do the plane. So at first it offsets everything. Then whatever is still left inside that box for random, it randomizes that stuff. Okay? So if I want everything to be random, regardless of whether it's way up here or way down there, all I have to do is swap the order. There we go. So what happens now is everything is random in that box, and then it pushes it up. Okay? So just be aware that we can change that order to control how things are happening. That looks cool. Then we'll go to random. I'm going to just take my scales. I really don't need these to be uniform. But I'm just going to make them -1 so they do get tiny. There we go. That's cool. I'll do a little bit of rotation on here. I didn't like that one. I like that. Okay. So now I have some rotation on that as well. I'm going to go to my plane. I'm going to set my scale here to be uniform and set this to -1. And the reason I'm doing that is because, like I said, we want to start off with a completely black image and then build on top of this black image something in color, vibrant, whatever. Okay? In order to do that, I have to basically make sure that my image, which is going to be this plane, is gone at the start of this. Just like our title, it's totally gone and then it appears. If I move my random, you'll see that we get this effect of it destroying itself and building itself as it moves along. Okay? Now, in the title one, we use plane, linear. We use linear. And what it does is everything that's on one side, it goes and just rebuilds it. So if I change this to linear, this is the same effect that we had before. Okay? So we could, there's black, and then here's it kind of rebuilding itself. So we definitely could do that again. But there's other stuff inside here that we should kind of explore and play with. So if I set this to sphere, and I fixed my proportions so it didn't look so weird. So 96, 96, 96. There we go. As I move this around, I'm going to get that same kind of effect. Okay? And what I can do with this is I'm going to make this bigger. So even like 500. As I move this around, you can see we're getting that same effect. But now we're creating more of a rounded edge instead of that straight edge, which is actually pretty boring looking. We're going to look at this from head on. So when we actually render this out, we're not going to do any camera move at all. It's going to be just like directly straight on like this. So the more design we can give it here, the better off we're going to be, the more nicer it's going to look. We can also play with the slice of this, which is kind of neat. Some people don't explore the tools enough. What this is doing is cutting where this is affecting. So right now, this is only affecting stuff that's inside of that hemisphere. So again, I could kind of shape it like this and have stuff get affected in a certain way. Okay, so just stuff to kind of keep in mind. That's cool. I could also invert this. Okay, and what inverting means is before everything inside the sphere was being affected, now everything outside the sphere gets affected. Now where this is cool is because we can basically create these shapes in the center that will get built. So if I take my size of this down to, let's say, 1, 1, and 1, we'll see nothing on the screen. But then as it gets bigger, I wish I could do all of them at the same time. Let me just set a keyframe real quick. I'll go here. I'll scooch you up to 60. And I'll make it 1,000 by 1,000. 1,000. So close. I'll just move it over like that. And I'll actually go maybe 1,200 by 1,200. That's better. Okay. All right. So now what this gives us is this. So we go. So you see how that sphere just kind of like lays out, which is super awesome, I think, anyway. You guys aren't geeked by this. You're weird. All right. Also, we can play with that center ring. So remember that that center ring is everything that is 100% affected, and that yellow ring is everything that is 0% affected, and then what happens in the middle is that fall off. So we can adjust this fall off and control how this thing is happening. So if I pull it like that and hit play, we get this animation. Okay. Now the reason it doesn't hit all the way is because nothing is in that very, very center pocket. So I would have to make my sphere out here even a lot bigger. So I would go to this and I would make this maybe 5,000. All right, that's going to be close enough, and I'm just going to take this fall off and just knock it down a hair like that. There we go. So the fall off is a bit bigger now. But now we still get this like really neat. Oh, I forgot something. Oh, this one's 50,000. You guys didn't tell me that. All right. All right. So we get this really cool effect. Awesome. Okay. So up to this point, we've done everything already that you've done. We just played with this fall off area in a different fashion than we've already done. Right? Cool. All right. So what this does, it creates a plane, and it does it to the plane. Now, I can do this to any kind of object. I'm going to create a cube, and I'm going to hide my plane. Oops. These little two dots here will hide your item. I'm clicking on the wrong item. There. Okay. I'm also going to hide the random and hide the cube. Oops, I want the cube, sorry. There we go. I want just this cube here. So what I want to do now is I want to take that. Instead of having a flat plane, I actually want to have something with thickness, something that I can adjust the sizing and shaping of this all later. So under MoGraph, there is a cloner. So right here is a cloner. And the way this works is whatever is inside the cloner will actually clone or duplicate itself. So I drag the cube into the cloner. And you'll see here I have 3 cubes stacked on top of each other. They're kind of intersecting. I go to the cloner object. Here's 3 cubes, like I said, 3 items. And here's the offset. This right here is basically the amount that it's moving. So just like on the plane or just like on the rotate, we have parameters to control how far it's going to move. That's what that one does. So if I set it to 100, or let me set it to 500, you can more easily see now I have 3 cubes that are just stacked on top of each other. If I add more cubes, the next one will also be offset to that same amount. Okay? Now this is doing a linear offset, basically a straight line. Okay? What's cool about this is that you can tell it to do something. So every time it duplicates it and it offsets it, it's moving it up, in this case, 500 centimeters. I could say every time I want you to scale 90%. So what that means is every time I do this, it's going to gradually get smaller and smaller and smaller, which could be a neat little effect. We could also have it rotate. So I'll rotate it 5 degrees. Now, as there's only 7 of these, not a huge deal. I'm going to take this down to maybe 250. That's better. And I'm going to take my count up like that. That looks good. Maybe I'll take this down to 200. Cool. Okay. So now you can see the effect of doing that. 95%. It's better. Now we actually see more. Okay. Now with the cloner, it still creates separate objects. That's the whole idea with using the random and using the plane, is that we have separated objects. The other one, we were able to get the separate objects by using that poly effects. With the cloner, they're already a separate object. Each one of these cubes is actually a separate object. If I hit C, it would actually create separate cubes. But now what we can do is go to this effector and go to, just like we did before, go to random, and it'll randomize those cubes. So now they're not perfectly lined up. If I go to box, just like before, and I make this bigger, I'm going to hold down shift so it goes like really fast. There it goes. As I move that random through this group, you'll see how they move. Pretty sweet. Let's go back to random off for a second. Go back to the cloner. All right. So this is linear. Straight line. I could turn it to, so I could, instead of just going straight up and down, I could give it a little bit of movement in one direction or the other. Okay, so now it's going off to that side. Again, no big deal. Oops. I can go to radial. My options have changed. I go to radius and crank this up. I can add more in here. So again, something else that would be really handy to be able to animate. Once I turn my random on, again, whatever's in that box, oops, click the random, come on, will then kind of shift around. Okay. Now, the one we're going to use is going to be the grid array. And what this does is it duplicates it in the X, Y, and Z. So we actually create a grid that is exactly that same size and shape. So we have, instead of just having the one number, we have 3 different numbers. How many do you want in X, Y, and Z? So Y, which is my up and down, I'm going to put, let's say, 1 there. There we go. And then for my count here, I'm going to take this up, and I'm going to take this up. Now, you'll see that they're like stacked super tight on top of each other. I need to spread them out, and that's where the size comes in. Right now, my cube is sized perfectly to 200 by 200 by 200. So as I stretch this out, and if I hold shift and do that, it goes faster. There we go. We'll eventually see how these are then separated right there. Okay, so I'll do that again going the other direction. Right there. Sweet. Okay, so now instead of having that boring flat plane, now we actually have cubes with some thickness to them. And then again, if I use that random and I pull it down here, you'll see how now these all break apart. Sweet. Let's go to the cloner. Let's go to MoGraph, effectors, plane. All right. I'm going to take my Y to 500. I'm going to take my X to, let's say, 100, and my Z to 100. I'll again give them the same scales that I did on the other one. So on the plane, I'm going to -1. And then on the rotation, I'll give them some random rotations like 60 here and 60 there. All right. So it disappeared because right now my fall off is set to infinite, meaning that the entire thing is going to do that. So I set it to box just like I did before. I make the box bigger. And this and this. So now when I grab this and move it, you'll see that they're going to do very similar to what they were doing before. So they're randomizing their movement, they're moving up, and then they're going away. Now I probably need to take that random and maybe crank this up a bit more. Maybe just add a 1 into that. So it's like 1900. There we go. That's good. And then the same thing with my plane. This 100 here, maybe this needs to be like 800 by 2500 by 800. Okay, so now we should have a lot of movement. There we go. Oops. And my boxes aren't lined up, so I need to make sure they're lined up so that they interact better. There we go. Okay. Okay, now they should be going to 0 for their scale. Let me double check. -1. Oh, they are. It's just these ones on the outside are not, because they're probably hitting, just like before, the random is too random. So let me take that down. There we go. So the random was pushing them too far away from that plane, so I had to make sure that it didn't affect it too much. So now we are back where we want to be. Cool. And then I can do the same thing I did before. I can grab both of these, go to the fall off, set it to invert, set this to sphere, and then animate these items kind of coming in there. Oh, that's awesome. That's very cool. All right. You could also duplicate these. So I could actually grab these random in planes that I've used before, copy those, and apply them to the other one. So if I just delete this, go back to this cloner, go back to effectors, and just drag the random and plane down here, then my animation will follow for there too. Oops, wrong button. Sweet. Now, it doesn't look exactly the same because the sizes are different from the original plane one that I did. Oops. All right, so there's the plane. You can see how tiny this is compared to this bigger one. So obviously the animation is going to be a bit different. But I can always come back to this original cube, and this is what's nice about it, and change everything. So this is 200 centimeters. So let's say I made it 5 centimeters. And then I go back to the cloner, go back to my object, and I'll set this to about 300. Oops. I'll set this one to about 600. That's pretty close. All right. So now if I look at the size of them, they're pretty close. The plane itself, I'll just hide and then look at the cube one. Oops. The cube one just slides right in. Cube, cloner. Alright, that's pretty good there. Let me shrink it this way. I think I actually just want to put more in here. And this is what's awesome about it, is very on the fly. You can add as many objects as you want. And I'm not sure why it's disappearing. Let me turn on random and plane. Oh, I must have moved one of them way far up. That's what I did. Alright, so let's watch and see. It's getting better. I don't know why it's so tiny still. Because that plane is bigger. Alright, so I'm just going to go back to my cloner, go back to my size, make this even wider, make this even longer. And I could even grab this and just pull it over. And I'll set my Y, I think, just to 1. That's all I need there. Okay, so now I'll hide the plane. And we have that. Perfect. Okay. Now again, the cool thing about this is that we actually have cubes, so we can do stuff to the cubes. So if I go back to the cube here, we can say, well, number one, we can say separate surfaces. That didn't do what I thought it would. Never mind. We'll do fillet. And what fillet can do is add some rounding to it. So now each one of these has just a little bit of a bevel around the edges. Okay? Now I'm going to show you what that's going to do when we render this out. So let me take this back here. Let me fill in my cloner. So I'm just going to keep adding to the count until this is exactly-ish right there. And then the same thing, exactly-ish. There's a lot going in this direction. Holy cow. There. Okay. Sweet. Alright, so I'm going to basically get this from that view. All right, so we render this out, and you'll see, yes, you can see, there's not a whole lot of line work there. So basically all of these faces are just touching each other right on the edge. And so we don't really see any depth or any more detail to it. So now watch what happens when I go to this cube and I just turn on that fillet. It takes a second. So now we're actually going to see more of a line division grid on each one of those items just because of how we have this fillet. And the more of a fillet I want on there, the more of a line I want on there, I'll just make that bigger. So maybe 0.15. And that'll make those lines a little bit thicker. The other thing I'm going to do eventually is under my render settings, under effect, I'm going to add ambient occlusion. And what this is going to do is it's going to read all those lines, all those areas where they're almost touching, and it'll create these little dark cavity areas. So it should look a little bit more darker in those areas. Yep, it's a subtler effect, but it's there. Okay, and I could again adjust that by just playing with this radius. It's going to take a second to calculate. There it is. And there it is. Cool. Okay, so that could add a nice effect to what we eventually end up doing with this. Sweet. So the next thing I want to do is I want to set up my camera for this. So I don't have the exact resolution we're going to be rendering this out at, but it's going to be basically a portrait size thing. Okay, so imagine like a movie poster or something like that. So if we go to, what that is. Here, you'll see a movie poster, one sheet, 27 by 41. That's a good size. Or 27 by 40, even better. So I'm going to go to my render settings. I'm going to go to my output. There we go. Okay, so I just typed in 270 by 400. This is just proportions. That's all I'm looking at. So 270 by 400 has the same proportions as 27 million by 4 million. 40 million, not 4 million. Okay, so that's all I wanted is to get that so that I could line this up. Now you'll find that as you start working with some of these things that it's going to start to go slower. So my machine is actually rotating very slowly. So I want to be very careful about how I do this. Okay, so I'm going to set up 2 views here. So I'm going to middle click. I'm going to drag my spacebar down. Actually, I'll just do this. 2 views side by side. That's perfect. All right. So this view here, I want this to be my camera. So I'm going to go to click on this. I'm going to create a new camera. And then I'm going to click on that white button. Okay. So now I'm inside the camera looking around. Now what I want to do is I want to lock my camera so it's always looking at that plane. So when I go to camera here, you'll see there's one called target camera, right? So just so you can see it, if I go here and say target camera, it creates a camera, it creates a target, and then it creates this little bullseye. That bullseye thing you can add afterwards to any camera. It doesn't have to be this specific one, okay? Just so you can see it. So I'm going to go to this camera, I'm going to go to tags, and somewhere inside this list is target. So I believe it's under camera. Nope. Tracker. Maybe just under this one. Yes, it is. Yep, just under the default 4D tags. There you go. So I add a target to this. Now what a target is basically I say I want you to always look at this item. So when you click on these tags, down here it'll let you pick what object you want to look at. So I wanted to always look at that cloner, so I drag the cloner to my target object. And so what happens is my camera just kind of like ticked for a second. I can only look at that. So as I move my camera around, okay, so I'm moving my camera, I'm trying to rotate. I'll even deselect the camera so we see it. There we go. Do you see how he's always looking at that target? Doesn't matter what I do with the camera, zoom in and out, move left and right, up and down, it's always focused on that area. Okay, so that's the whole point of having that. And then what I'm going to do is in this view, oops, not that view. I want to go into my regular perspective view. There we go. Okay. And I want to see that camera wherever he is, right there. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to change his position to 0, 0, 0. Then I'm just going to move him straight up. And what you're going to see is that because I moved him straight up, he's basically going to be looking straight at that plane. And then I can just move it so that he's lined up perfectly with it. Now, my proportions for the plane may not be 27 by 40, which is what we set up. So again, very simple. I can go to my cloner, try to find as close of a number to 27 by 40 as I can. And a little trick that I can do is if I constrain these 270 by 400 in here, I could punch in one of these numbers and it'll give me what the other number is going to be. Okay, so I know that this is 567 by 991. So if I just type in for the width 567, then my other number should be 840. So that's a quick way to get the proportions of what we're supposed to be getting, so they match. And I'll just round this to 567. Now I may need to change how many cubes I have here. I can worry about that later. I just want to make sure that was set up, and then I can move my camera some more. Oops. I'm moving the cloner, not the camera. I need to make sure I click on the camera. Now what we should see is I should be able to get this pretty close to being right on, like that. That's pretty close. Awesome. So now when I render this, you'll see that I should get a 27 by 40 proportionate image with all of my cubes lined up perfectly. Now eventually what we'll do with this is we'll make a little animation, and then we'll be able to project it onto something and make like an image appear, make something, you know, make it look like the flat image or the flat plane actually has some more depth to it than it typically would. Cool. Definitely needs to be shrunk down. Okay. So if you get done with your title, then you can move on to this. I'll check the title stuff next week. So Wednesday I'll check it just in case you need more time to render. But you should try to plan on starting this by Monday. Okay. Any questions? Sir?